The next president of the United States might come from Florida. We got to talk a little bit about Ron DeSantis, but also there's a bill now apparently in Florida's legislature that might end up banning bloggers unless they register with the state if they even so much as mention politicians or the governor. Now, Twitter is generally a terrible place for actually getting a deep information on what's going on, but Mr. Newt Gingrich was trending yesterday here for his tweet where he wrote, "The idea that bloggers criticizing a politician should register with the government is insane. It is an embarrassment that it is a Republican state legislature in Florida who introduced the bill to that effect. He should withdraw it immediately." And then, of course, there's a lot of lashing out against Newt Gingrich, a lot of people saying things like, hey, well, you're the reason that the Republican Party is like this, and you should take responsibility. You're basically embarrassing yourself. You get a lot of that sort of drama. So what I like to do is I like to go right to the source, and I think that's often, actually almost always, what's missing from Twitter. So jumping right into the source, and then we'll talk about what Mr. DeSantis is up to. Take a look at this. There actually is a bill, and it's called the Act Relating to Information Dissemination. And basically, it would require bloggers to register with the Office of Legislative Services or the Commission of Ethics, requiring bloggers file monthly reports with the appropriate office by a certain date. Now, there's some details here that suggest basically if you're a blogger who gets paid, you're required to register. So they define here what a blogger is, someone who frequently updates opinion, commentary, or business content. A blogger means any person who submits a blog post, which is published. Okay, great. And it has to be for compensation. But this is pretty broad here. Compensation includes anything of value provided to the blogger in exchange for a blog post or series of blog posts. Now, that's really interesting because, I mean, in theory, you could say making a YouTube video is for compensation, right? Because you get ad revenue. You post an article on the Medium, you get ad revenue. Now, YouTube didn't go to me, or the Medium doesn't go to people and say, please make an article or a video about DeSantis and then we'll pay you, right? So this is a pretty vaguely written bill because it doesn't clarify that, and it could potentially mean anyone, and obviously technically Florida only has jurisdiction over Florida, but they don't say if you don't reside in Florida, you're exempt from this. Now, obviously, the reach of their power, their policing power would not exceed past Florida, but what if you make videos about DeSantis in California and then you go visit Florida? You know, are you now going to get fined because you're somebody who has blogged and not reported potentially in Florida as well? It's sort of interesting. And so it's raising a lot of eyebrows about the idea that, hey, like, if compensation is so broad, what you're basically saying is anybody who even talks about state representatives or the governor needs to register with the state of Florida. And it's really starting to feel a little sort of anti-free speech-esque, which is really odd because generally it's been the Republican Party over the last few years who's been sort of clamoring for free speech. And while I don't think anybody really is anti-free speech, the big divisiveness of, on one side, it's, hey, we got to control dis and misinformation, right? And on the other side, it's, no, just let everything be free, right? That's been a pretty political and politically divisive talking point. And so the idea that Ron DeSantis' government, who's potentially going to do whatever he needs to get done over this next year, at least that's what sort of political researchers are saying, that Florida's legislature basically wants to prop up Ron DeSantis to potentially become governor because it would be good for all of the people in the legislature. If he becomes president, he might pick from that legislature to have sort of a cabinet or build out a cabinet if he were to become president. So it's really interesting that you've got, on one hand, a lot of this talk about free speech, but now you're basically censoring free speech by forcing monthly reports on people for any basically reason for posting a blog, simply if you comment on the governor or representative. That seems a little odd. At the same time, you have Ron DeSantis, who just visited, and this comes after CPAC, by the way, which was this weekend, where Donald Trump won sort of the straw poll, but that somewhat seemed to be a little bit more of a Trump-attended event. Ron DeSantis wasn't there. Instead, Ron DeSantis was actually in California. He was actually in my home county here in Simi Valley, and I thought that was very interesting. Ron DeSantis went to the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library, sold about 1,300 tickets. And he talked about this great American exodus from states governed by leftist politicians and how people are voting with their feet. I mean, this is old news. We've been using that phrase for, for probably for decades, quite frankly, but really heavily since the pandemic. It's hard to argue, though, that people are solely voting with their feet because of politics. California has gotten really expensive. And in part because, California is really beautiful in terms of like physically, people are awesome, the weather's cool, but the politicians are loony. Okay, so we know that. Well, but the Wall Street Journal, for example, alleges, there's probably a good chance people are leaving California, the ones who are, because of a lack of affordable housing and hybrid work setups that really allow you to go from like a 3 and 2 here to like a 6-bedroom mansion in Texas, or even Florida, right? But anyway, Ron DeSantis at his event in Simi Valley talked about, of course, having empowered people to make a choice as to whether or not they want to take the vaccine, not enforcing mandates. And this is interesting because early in the pandemic, Ron DeSantis was actually a big proponent of getting vaccinated, but now he's sort of trying to back that away by saying, hey, but I was super anti-mandate and my schools were open over here, right? And the Washington Post interviewed some attendees at the event who described themselves as Trumpers, but they responded and said, Ron DeSantis seems like Trump, but less divisive and potentially with a brain. Now, I thought that maybe that obviously that was potentially, they picked that one quote because it's a little extreme. But this idea that maybe Ron DeSantis would be like the diet version of Donald Trump and maybe a little less divisive is really interesting because, it does seem like there's a chance you'll have a Ron DeSantis v. Trump primary. And then on the other side, you might have, if Biden runs, you'll probably just have Biden. If Biden doesn't run, you'll probably have like a Newsom/Kamala runoff. So we'll see. But anyway, what's also very interesting, and it kind of goes back to sort of how this is all piecing together, is Ron DeSantis is trying to create the narrative of everyone fleeing California, which again, to some regards is true, but on the other hand is really pro-free speech, while you see at the same time also this sort of almost anti-free speech-ish bill in Florida. But it's not just that, it's also what's going on with Disney and how Disney is kind of being used as a pawn here for DeSantis's efforts. So here's actually an op-ed piece in the Wall Street Journal by the man himself, Ron DeSantis himself. And he talks about how on Monday he signed a law ending Disney's self-governing status of over 43 square miles. Disney no longer has its own government. And really, this is starting to make people reiterate the idea that, man, on one hand, Ron DeSantis is all like, hey, free speech, free speech, free speech. But then why is your legislature putting together something that kind of potentially restricts free speech, requiring this registration? It's basically burden, right? When you put a burden on speech, you essentially restrict it. It's kind of like, hey, you know what? We want you to put these gloves on while you're writing your paper. It's just another step. We're not stopping you from writing, but we want you to go through another step. And if the more steps we put on you, then the more inconvenient it is, the less likely you produce content, right? That's usually how it works. So it's not really eliminating the opportunity to speak, but it is restricting that somewhat. And a lot of this drama we're seeing about Disney is also about free speech. See, Disney, and Ron DeSantis obviously talks about this in here, and I'll go a little bit into more depth, but basically, he talks about how, hey, look, if you go woke, go broke. Go to Florida, and wokeness dies. Like, Florida is the place where wokeness goes to die, is essentially what Ron DeSantis argues. And he says it here: we are making Florida the state where the economy flourishes because we are the state where woke goes to die. And he makes this argument that corporations should not involve themselves in politics, and that basically Disney ended up, challenging this idea that Florida was going to put up the essentially don't say gay bill. Now, that phrase is not actually in the bill. It's just how everybody knows it. That's the politically popular way of talking about it. It basically says, hey, we don't want sexual education for people under a certain age, children under a certain age. Like 5-year-olds shouldn't be talked to about basically sexual education or gender orientation or gender identity. And Disney had long been silent on that. But generally what you find is silence these days in 2023 is deemed to be sort of permission. And so this is where Ron DeSantis argues, look, they took a stand that was anti my bill, and now we're punishing them for that. Now, in my opinion, that's somewhat slamming Disney from a free speech point of view, right? Like if corporations are allowed to have a voice, which they are allowed to have a voice, obviously, then they should be able to speak freely without fear of punishment. The idea that then potentially Ron DeSantis starts restricting rights from Disney, I think is somewhat interesting because it basically sends a signal to any business in Florida, hey, if you don't align with our policies, we'll find a way to screw you. Now, whether or not you agree with the don't say gay does not matter here. Like, don't get me wrong, I got a 5 and 7-year-old, and they don't need to hear about gender identity or gay or anything. They're way too young for that, okay? 5 and 7-year-old, no, okay? Let's wait until like at least 5th grade, please, or like middle school, or high school, obviously, it's fine, but like young children, no. So again, I'm not making a stand here that Ron DeSantis and the Don't Say Gay bill is wrong or right. It's not the case at all. If anything, I think it makes a lot of sense. But the idea that DeSantis is sort of building his campaign on, to some degree, silencing some form of speech, in my opinion, sort of runs counter to the Republican ideal of no, all free speech, right? Because in essence, you're trying to restrict bloggers, and in essence, you are trying to restrict businesses from taking a stand. Now, of course, you might say, oh, well, Disney has no place to be taking a stand. But wait, isn't that restricting free speech, right? So now, what I also think is very interesting is Ron DeSantis goes on to say the following here. Disney's special arrangement, which dates back to 1967, was an indefensible example of corporate welfare. Now, this, I think, is remarkable. Indefensible example of corporate welfare. I'll let him keep going, and then I'll respond to that. It provided the company with favorable tax treatment, including the ability to assess its own property valuations and enjoy benefits of regional infrastructure improvements without paying taxes towards the project. It exempted Disney from Florida's building and fire prevention codes. It even allowed Disney to build a nuclear power plant and to use eminent domain to seize property outside the district's boundaries. While the districts are common in Florida, Disney's deal was conspicuous in the massive benefits it conferred. Okay, so first of all, it's really worth understanding what happened here, okay? Because this right here makes it sound like DeSantis is coming in on basically a white horse and saying, how dare Disney wield all this power? We will take it back. But you have to remember what Orlando was before 1967. Folks, it was nothing. It was swampland. That's it. In fact, much of Florida still today is swamp. And that's not a diss on Florida. I spent 16 years growing up in Florida. I love Florida. I'll actually be at Florida later this week. But this idea that, we got to take back all that was given to Disney. Disney created Orlando. Disney built its own fire department, police station. It built its own, the parks. And this idea that Disney used its eminent domain to seize private property. Let's hold on for a moment. Disney's eminent domain power actually led Disney to preserve a lot of the natural forestry that's around Disney because they wanted that on purpose to make the whole Disney World area feel as sort of natural as possible. Now, don't get me wrong. Yeah, there are going to be cases where certain land was transformed into potentially a parking lot. Duh, but then again, it was all a swamp. But when you go to Disney World or even you fly into Orlando, you're like, damn, a lot of trees over here. It's not like Disney leveled everything. Also, this idea that Disney, was allowed to build a nuclear reactor, that's true because Disney takes a lot of power, but they never ended up building their own nuclear reactor. And even if they did, that would be better than what we have today, which is a natural gas power plant instead of a nuclear reactor. Now, Florida does have its own nuclear reactors, which is great, but remember what Disney was supposed to be. Disney was supposed to be the experimental prototype community of tomorrow. That stands for Epcot, right? It was supposed to be a futuristic city that would be home to 20,000 residents in an area that there never used to be people. So Disney World needed to move fast. They needed to build roads, emergency services, utilities. Disney did that. They built the levees. They built the drainage system. Yes, did other parts of Florida end up hooking up to those projects and benefit from that economic impact? Of course. But Ron DeSantis, we got to look at the numbers. I wrote down some of them over here. Disney's a huge part of Florida. Look at Oxford Economics. I used before the pandemic just because some of the 2022 numbers aren't available yet. And if you go into 21 and 2020, things are very skewed by the pandemic. So I just wanted to look at 2019 since we're likely to trend back to that trend, as most things are in business. But look at 2019. Disney World had a $75.2 billion economic impact on Florida. Florida's GDP is just under $1 trillion. That means Disney World itself sets up about 7.7% of Florida's entire GDP. 4.5% of the people who work in Florida work for Disney World or somehow employed as a contractor by Disney or work for Disney in some regard. And $5.8 billion of Florida's tax revenue, or 15.9%, comes from Disney World. So I find it really interesting, and I kind of have a conclusion to all of this. So first of all, you have this the speech bill, right, restricting speech in Florida. Then you have this sort of Disney removing basically their policing powers, which policing powers include building and safety and infrastructure and everything, blah, 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 right? So you have the speech bill, then you have Disney, then you have this idea of woke goes to die in Florida. So my take on this, is that right now in society, we do have a very split United States right now. On one hand, we have this idea that everything has turned woke, although the idea of woke has really become extreme, right? Woke used to just be awareness, right? It used to be aware. So you were sort of aware maybe of privileges or differences, right? This has now gone to the extreme, right? So there's the extreme version, and then there's sort of the normal version of this. And then what you have happening in Florida is really you've gone to the anti-woke extreme. And so that's really the fight of what I think is the 2024 election and what we're going to see a lot of. You're going to basically have an argument of the extreme versus the extreme. Now, personally, I hate that because I think the vast majority of Americans sort of sit in the middle like, yeah, look, some things over here make sense. Some things over here make sense. That doesn't make sense. That doesn't make sense. And I personally think that Disney and the speech bill have really just sort of become pawns to the idea of reiterating this extreme, because that seems to be what's probably most popular for Republican candidates right now. And so I don't actually think anything practically is going to change at Disney. In fact, Disney World Florida has a board that controls the sort of the Reedy Creek district, and Ron DeSantis can now sort of put his puppets on that board. But the reality is Florida probably, or Disney World, kind of's already built out what they're going to build out, right? Now, that's not to say that they won't want to continue to develop, but like these special powers really mattered when they were going from swamp to something. Now it doesn't matter so much anymore. So in my opinion, both of these things aren't really going to change anything. They're just examples of what DeSantis is trying to use to build up his platform to really fight Donald Trump. So I think that's very interesting. Somebody here, Pet Brett, says anti-woke equals let me continue being a bigot. No, I don't agree with that. I think if somebody, maybe we say the anti-extreme would be the better way to put that, right? Like, I don't think somebody is a bigot for saying I don't want my 5-year-old to be taught about gender identity, right? I don't think that's being a bigot. I think that's, trying to be reasonable. But of course, we could go down the spectrum and go, well, at some point, we probably all agree with things. It's funny. Like, I'll have a drink with people of totally random and totally different political ideologies. Extreme people on like the super far left, or the super far right, or super libertarian, or whatever. And I'll tell you, we usually, even though people identify as potentially super one thing, most people are relatively reasonable. It's surprising. I'm not saying everyone, don't get me wrong, right? But it is really, really interesting. I think that's fascinating. So this election cycle is going to be incredible. Somebody here says, Kevin contradicts himself. He says that this is an example of anti-woke extremism in one breath, and then says won't really matter in the big picture. How is that true? Okay, so what I'm saying is, so I'm not contradicting myself, actually. You're just reiterating what I'm saying. What I'm saying is anti-woke extremism is punishing Disney's free speech and taking away their policing powers, really. That's the way it's being put up on a pedestal. Oh, you go woke, you go broke. But the reality is this probably isn't going to affect Disney at all. In fact, I would not be surprised if Ron DeSantis picked up the phone, talked to Bob Iger, who just took over as CEO again, and said, look, man, I'm going to put some puppets in. You guys just keep doing you, but I'm going to go use this as a political tool to show everybody that you don't mess with Ron DeSantis. That's what I'm saying. So maybe there was just a misunderstanding in how I explained that, but I don't think. I think it's almost a little bit like Florida-style virtue signaling, dare I say, right? Like, it's not really going to make a difference to Disney World, but it does help sort of prop up his campaign. Now, don't get me wrong. I want to be very clear here, because sometimes I make these videos and people think, oh, so you hate DeSantis. No, that's not what I'm saying. Like, personally, from what I'm seeing, I would probably much prefer a DeSantis over like a Gavin Newsom, who gives stimulus checks during an inflationary era and can't save homeless people or contribute to mental health for the life of them, and doesn't seem to care about financial education in schools. In fact, Ron DeSantis was one of the first states and one of the first governors to pass a bill requiring financial fitness, basically, financial education in schools. That's something that I ran a campaign on for governor in 2020. So completely agree, by the way. I think it's very, very interesting. Very, very interesting, and definitely worth talking about. So those are some of my thoughts. But hey, I'll look for your thoughts in the comments. Somebody here writes, people are fact-phobic. Well, that's honestly, I think you watching videos on Twitter is extremely smart. Like me or hate me, you watching videos on, if I said Twitter, I meant YouTube. You watching videos on YouTube is extremely smart, because this is where you can actually have more of a dialogue and get deeper into topics. Whereas on Twitter, I mean, go back to what we saw with the Newt Gingrich stuff or whatever. The stuff is just extreme, like absolutely extreme. People, like the messaging doesn't really tell you anything about what's going on, right? I mean, we just made, a 10, 15-minute segment here on Florida politics where Newt makes one comment and people bash him like crazy, and nobody actually knows what's going on, right? So I'm a big fan of that sort of perspective, but you have to sort of seek that out. Otherwise, you kind of stay... You stay uninformed. Hey, thanks so much for watching and subscribing, as well as sharing the videos. In case you've enjoyed it, make sure to consider getting more perspective via the links down below in becoming a millionaire through real estate investing. It's one of our most popular courses, 0 to Millionaire Real Estate Investing. That is often bundled with the Stocks and Psychology of Money group or the Do-It-Yourself Property Management and Rental Renovations Guide. After that, you can also check out the Elite Hustlers, which has its own special exclusive live stream for people looking to make more money as an individual earner, or that is as an entrepreneur, or as an employee. And of course, check out the other programs specifically for agents or YouTube content creators.